I didn't always believe silence had power. For most of my life, I believed the opposite. I believed that if something needed to be said, you said it. If something was wrong, you addressed it. If you wanted respect, you earned it by being direct, by being real, by not hiding behind comfort. That belief shaped who I was long before I ever stepped into the WNBA. It shaped how I played, how I competed, how I led, and how I carried myself in rooms where pressure was constant and expectations were high. I thought speaking up was strength. I thought clarity came from honesty. I thought silence was something people used when they were afraid, unsure, or unwilling to stand on what they believed. And for a long time, that mindset worked. It worked in locker rooms, it worked in practices, it worked in moments where accountability actually led to growth. So when I arrived at the highest level, I brought that same approach with me, convinced that the league would reward it the same way the game always had. But no one tells you that the WNBA isn't just about basketball. It's about balance, about image, about timing, about how comfortable your presence makes other people feel. No one sits you down and explains that part. There's no orientation for it. You learn it while you're competing, while you're being watched, while every word you say has the potential to follow you. Longer than the effort you put in. At first, you don't even notice it happening. You're too focused on adjusting to the pace, the physicality, the grind of the season. You think the pressure you feel is just normal, that it's just part of growing. But slowly, things start to feel different in ways you can't quite name. The room feels quieter when you speak, conversations feel shorter, reactions feel delayed, and none of it is dramatic enough to call out, but all of it is consistent enough to register. That's when I started realizing that the league doesn't just evaluate how you play, it evaluates how you fit, how your voice blends into the environment, how much space your honesty takes up. And that realization forces you to reflect in ways you never had to before. So you start asking yourself whether being right matters more than being effective, whether saying something actually changes anything or just adds another layer of tension that you'll have to manage later. You don't lose your belief in honesty overnight, but you begin to see that honesty alone doesn't always move things forward. And that understanding sets the stage for a much harder lesson, one about cost, consequence, and why silence starts looking less like avoidance and more like survival. The real conflict started when I realized that the cost of speaking wasn't immediate, but cumulative. It wasn't one moment where everything changed. It was a slow build. Every time I spoke honestly, I felt like I was adding a small weight to a scale I couldn't see. One comment here, one conversation there, nothing explosive, nothing headline worthy. But over time, the balance shifted. I noticed how the same words, coming from different people, were received differently. How tone mattered more than intent. How honesty from some was framed as leadership, while honesty from others felt like disruption. And once you become aware of that imbalance, it messes with your instincts. You start hesitating before saying things that once felt natural. You replay sentences in your head before they ever leave your mouth, not because you're unsure of what you believe, but because you're trying to predict how it will be interpreted. And that's exhausting. Because now you're not just playing basketball, you're managing perception in real time. You don't want to trade honesty for safety, but you also don't want to keep absorbing unnecessary friction that drains you mentally over time. And that's the tension no one prepares you for. The tension between being yourself and being strategic, between saying what's true and protecting your energy, between proving a point and preserving your place. You start understanding that not every truth needs a microphone and not every moment is meant to be explained. And that doesn't mean the truth stops mattering. It means the timing of it does. Silence, I learned, isn't about fear. It's about awareness. It's about understanding the environment you're operating in and deciding where your energy actually creates change. It's about recognizing that in a league built on perception, as much as performance, every word carries weight beyond its intention. And once that clicks, you stop seeing silence as weakness. You start seeing it as a skill, one that requires discipline, patience, and a deep understanding of yourself. Because choosing not to speak when you have something to say is often harder than speaking at all. And that's the part nobody talks about. And that's the part I had to learn the hard way. At the beginning, speaking up didn't feel like a choice. It felt like responsibility. That's how I had always understood leadership. If something could be better, you said it. If something fell off, you addressed it. Not to cause tension, but to clear it. I came into the league believing that honesty was how trust was built, how standards were set, how teams grew. Coaches say they want accountability, teammates say they want clarity, and fans say they want authenticity. So I assumed those values carried all the way to the top. I assumed the WNBA, being the highest level, would reward that mindset even more. And in the early days, it felt like it did. Conversations were open. The feedback was direct. Communication felt like part of the culture. So I leaned into it. I didn't hold things back. I didn't sugarcoat. I didn't speak just to hear my own voice, but I didn't hide either. I thought being clear would prevent misunderstandings, that addressing things early would keep them from becoming bigger issues later. And that belief made sense to me because it had always worked before. Every step of the journey up to this point had reinforced it. Speak up, compete, move forward. But what I didn't understand yet was that as the stakes rise, honesty starts being measured differently. The same words can land differently, depending on timing, context, and who's listening. At this level, it's not just about what's said, it's about how it fits into the larger picture. And that larger picture isn't always focused on improvement. Sometimes it's focused on stability, on avoiding disruption, on keeping things smooth. And that's when honesty starts creating friction, not because it's wrong, but because it challenges comfort. I began noticing that speaking up didn't always lead to clarity anymore. Sometimes it led to distance, not immediate, not obvious, but gradual. You could feel the temperature change in the room. Conversations became more guarded. Feedback felt more filtered. And the strangest part was that nothing specific was ever pointed out. No one said, "You talk too much." No one said, "This is a problem." It was all subtle, all unspoken, which made it harder to understand because you can't adjust to rules that are never clearly stated. That's when doubt starts creeping in. Not about your ability, not about your work ethic, but about the environment you're in. You start wondering why saying the same things you've always said suddenly feels heavier, why honesty doesn't land the way it used to, why silence seems to smooth things over faster than explanation ever does. And that realization is unsettling because it challenges the foundation you built your confidence on. You're taught your whole life that being real is non-negotiable, that authenticity is respected, that leaders speak. But at this level, you start seeing that leadership can also mean restraint. That respect can come from what you don't say just as much as what you do. And that silence, when used intentionally, can be a form of control rather than avoidance. I remember the first time I noticed how differently silence was treated compared to honesty. It wasn't in a big moment. It wasn't an argument or a headline. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in how energy moved around me when I chose to speak versus when I didn't. When I spoke, things felt tense, even if the words were measured. When I stayed quiet, things moved on faster. That contrast stuck with me because it didn't make sense based on how I understood the game. Basketball had always been direct. You adjust, you correct, you communicate. But here, communication came with consequences that weren't always visible. And once you see that, you start paying closer attention. You start watching how others move, who speaks freely, who stays quiet, who gets labeled, who gets space. And you realize that silence isn't accidental in this league, it's learned. That realization doesn't come with relief, it comes with conflict. Because you don't want to become someone you don't recognize. You're constantly asking yourself whether being honest will actually help or whether it will quietly move you further away from the center of the room. The hardest part is that no one ever tells you you're doing anything wrong. There's no correction, no clear feedback, just a gradual sense that the safest version of you is the quietest one. And when that realization sinks in, you start understanding why silence becomes attractive in this league. Not because players are afraid, but because they're tired of paying invisible costs for being real. That's when silence stopped feeling accidental and started feeling intentional. I began noticing how often the players who lasted, the ones who stayed centered in the system, weren't necessarily the loudest or the most outspoken, but the most measured. They knew when to speak and when to let things pass. They understood that not every moment was worth engaging, and not every truth needed to be explained immediately. At first, that felt uncomfortable to accept, because it went against everything I believed about leadership. But the more I observed, the clearer it became. Silence wasn't not weakness here. It was a form of control, a way to protect focus, a way to avoid unnecessary friction in an environment where every interaction leaves a trace. I realize that the league rewards stability more than confrontation, even when confrontation is honest. And once you understand that, you start making different choices. Not because you've lost your voice, but because you've learned how expensive it can be to use it carelessly. Silence in that context isn't about shrinking yourself. It's about choosing your moments carefully, knowing that the impact of your words lasts far longer than the moment you say them.